我而家咧就將嗰個mic咧交俾我哋咧，就係一個今日嘅主講嘉賓啦嚇 ，keynote speaker 就係 Mycle 首先開始即係講，佢今日講嘅題目咧就係福島即係災難之後咧，核災之後咧，國際上嘅能源同埋再生能源嘅發展嘅。好，我哋請 Mycle。
Thank you very much for that introduction. This is my first time in Hong Kong, and I'm really excited about that. As I've worked on the Daya Bay issue basically before day one, because I was observing the negotiations and contracting in 1980s already around the project, and I was actually amazed about the opposition movement that existed in the 1980s at a time before many of you in this room were even born. But actually there has been a very strong movement at the time with collecting over 1.5 million signatures against the Daya Bay Guangdong nuclear power project within 3 months. That was the largest of such actions I had heard of until that moment. So what I will try to do today is to give you an overview of the status and trends and international developments on nuclear power, and to some extent compare this with what happens in other areas. So we'll walk you through some history of nuclear power. I think it's very important to observe energy policy over the long term. You cannot really understand these issues if you just get a picture of a current situation in 1 year. In order to understand trends, the picture is not enough, you have to look at the movie. So that's what I'm trying to do, to basically give you the movie on the nuclear industry over the past 60 years. So here we have the nuclear startups and shutdowns. Startup for us is the connection to the electricity grid, and shutdown is the disconnection from the electricity grid. So in green we have the startups, and in red the shutdowns. We can easily see that there were 2 very large startup waves. The first one in the 1970s and the second one in the 1980s. But that ever since the end of the 1980s, the red and the green is basically on the same level. So there were not major startups of nuclear reactors. Now this goes up to July 2013. In the second half of 2013, there were 3 more nuclear power plants connected to the grid, 2 in China and 1 in India. And in 2014, in January, there is another Chinese reactor that started up, Ningde, the second unit of Ningde. So let's look at the picture in an accumulated manner. So we had, these are reactors in operation per year throughout the world. So we see this rise uninterrupted until the end of the 1980s. And then we have basically a flat situation. So there's not much increase, not much development ever since the 1980s. I will be trying to give you more, this is really meant as a trend analysis. So looking at what goes up and what goes down, what is big, what is small, rather than picking a specific figure. We can discuss forever specific numbers, but it's very more precise to look at trends. Whether it's one more or one less, if you have 400, is irrelevant to the trend. Even if, of course, if you're a citizen that lives very close to this one reactor more or less, this very specific one plant is very important to you. But this is a global international overview, so we're interested more in the big picture. The peak of the number of units that were in operation was already achieved in 2002. So it is not that there was something that was triggered by 311. 311 merely had an accelerating effect. The peak was already 10 years earlier. The other curve you see in here is the installed electricity generating capacity from nuclear power. And as you can see, it's always interesting to look at graphs, the shape of the curves. And as you see, the shape of the curve is not exactly the same as the number of reactors. This is mainly for two reasons. First, new nuclear power plants generally are bigger than the ones that are shut down. So the same number of reactors brings a larger electricity generating capacity. The second reason is that in many cases it has been done so-called uprating. Uprating means you increase the installed capacity at an existing reactor by technical means. It's like you put a new motor in an old car, or a turbo onto the old motor. And these increases in capacity through uprating can be very significant. You can raise the installed capacity by over 20% that way. So it's substantial, and substantial amounts of nuclear capacity have been added this way. So how many reactors are currently operating? Actually, it sounds like a very simple question. It turns out very complicated. And the main reason is the situation in Japan. Now, if we go to the International Atomic Energy Agency's website, the IAEA is a UN agency on nuclear power. We have, in the world overview, a number which says 435 nuclear power reactors in operation. Now, in operation, I would assume, is a simple term. A reactor that is in operation is generating electricity, isn't it? Well, not precisely. If we go to the national Japanese page on the same website, we see here operational 48. Now this is a screenshot from 26 February 2014. If you go on the website today, it's the same one. So it says 48 operational. This number, these 48, are integrated in this number. Reality is that none of these reactors actually generate electricity. None. Zero. There have been no nuclear power plants generating electricity since September 2013. And over the past 2 years, only 2 reactors have generated electricity. So I find it kind of difficult to call these reactors in operation. So it's basically a misleading number that is out there. So if we take that into account, then we have to wonder, well, how many reactors can we consider as potentially in operation in Japan? We therefore have made 3 scenarios. Our baseline scenario, so our figures, consider that the 10 Fukushima reactors will never restart, so they're shut down. In our statistics, they're considered shut down. The second scenario we call the East Coast scenario. we consider that the reactors that have been impacted directly or indirectly by the events of 3/11 would not restart. That's another 7 reactors. And finally, we have an additional scenario which we call the German scenario, which considers that all the reactors that have been operating for 30 years and more will not restart. Why do we call it German scenario? After 3/11, the German government immediately took the decision to shut down half of the German nuclear reactor fleet, 8 reactors out of 17, under a one criteria decision, which was the age of the facilities. So all the reactors over 30 years have been shut down. So if we do that, we add another 13 reactors to the ones that would not restart. So we get to another 20 units between those two scenarios that would not restart. However, all this is speculation. Right? At this point, nobody knows how many reactors would restart, if any. So we don't know, how many reactors are to be considered in operation. And I don't think it's so important to really put a number on it. If we're talking around 400 nuclear units in operation as we speak, so that, in historic terms, brings us back to the 1980s, to the late 1980s. That's the message to take home, right? Whatever the precise number is, it's a level that we already had in the late 1980s. Now, in the absence of major new build programs around the world, the average age of nuclear reactors in operation continues to increase. In our annual report, it's been very easy. We didn't even have to calculate. Every year we can add 1 year, right? So average age last year was 28 years, and you can bet that average age this year is going to be 29 years in the new report that comes out in the summer. You remember the 2 construction waves, startup waves. We find them now back here in this graph with the increased age. So we have the old reactors pushing towards 40 years. This is the 1970 curve, and this is the even larger 1980s wave of startup. So we're currently have 31 units that have operated already more than 40 years. 190 units have operated more than 30 years. So it's roughly half of the world's nuclear fleet has operated for 30 years or more. I mean, 30 years, I don't know how many amongst you remember what the cars looked like in the streets 30 years ago. I mean, it was a quite different technology, right? So this is basically old technology we're looking at. Now, if we go from the worldwide scale to the European Union, and we look at the same graph for the numbers of reactors in operation in the European Union, we get a very similar shape in the build-up of the nuclear power program until the end of the 1980s. However, what is interesting is from then on, we don't have a flat development, we have a significant decrease. Now, this is actually important in the context of reporting, for example, 1 new reactor under construction in France and another new reactor under construction in Finland. 2 reactors under construction do not have any significant influence on the trend, right? None. It's irrelevant to the trend whether these reactors will go online or not. They don't change the trend because we have now 46 reactors less operating than at the peak in 1988. So 2 reactors, more or less, don't change anything. So the trend is very clear in the European Union. The next level, which is interesting to look at, is after having seen the installed capacity and the numbers of reactors, we look at the production of electricity by nuclear power plants. And as we can see, quite differently from the numbers and installed capacities, the electricity generation has increased and peaked in 2006. So it has actually increased much longer than the number of reactors or the installed capacity. This is mainly because some countries have done a lot of work in raising the load factor, so raising the productivity out of from their reactors. This is particularly true for the United States, and the United States operate 100 reactors, so it's a quarter of the nuclear fleet in the world, so it has very major implications for the global statistics. So they operate better. I mean, they run better than they used to operate. On the other hand, this curve indicates the relative share that nuclear power provides in the electricity mix worldwide. And this is quite surprising. I must admit, we always find something new ourselves. I mean, I've been working on this issue for 30 years, and still we discover sometimes numbers or facts which we're really surprised about. And this was one of those surprise factors when we did that the first time, is to actually realize that the maximum share of nuclear power in the electricity mix in the world was already achieved 20 years ago, in 1993. 20 years ago. And that in fact, of course, 311 had an impact on this, but it's a mere acceleration of a pre-existing trend. It's by no means a trigger, and it's a big difference. It's not that the industry had been in great shape and had been booming. A lot of times the term renaissance has been used. This is not the case. The industry has been in decline for a long time, and Fukushima has been accelerating the trend. So the 2012 approximate share of nuclear power in the electricity mix is down to just over 4%. If we go and look at country by country electricity generation from nuclear power, we realize first that it's not like spread out over the planet. It's 31 countries, which is 15% of the UN members, so it's a very small number of countries worldwide that use nuclear power. And even within those countries, you see that there is a very strong concentration of nuclear power generation in a small number of countries. So the big five, the first big countries, actually generate about 2/3 of the nuclear electricity in the world. And these are the US, France, Russia, the Korean Republic, and Germany. Germany, interestingly enough, is still amongst the top 5. Quite surprising, maybe. Of course, Germany is one of the countries, like with Japan, that has dropped in significance because of the events after 3/11. Now, it is interesting to see that the overall trend over the past few years has obviously been a significant decline in generation. We had a decline of 7% in 2012 over 2011, which is a huge drop if you put it into international context. 3/4 of that drop is due to Japan. But I might say only 3/4. So there's a lot of other things that are happening in other countries. And in fact, all of the 5 big players reduced their nuclear energy generation in 2012 over 2011. This is to look at the nuclear share in the electricity mix country by country. And we see that the shape of this graph is quite different from the electricity generation. We see that one country is a little different from others. That's the country I come from, France. Of course, France is exceptional. France has the largest share, with about 3/4 of its electricity coming from nuclear power. In fact, France generates almost half of the nuclear electricity in the European Union. So one country, almost half of all the nuclear electricity in the European Union. The other thing which is really interesting is that, when you look at historic maximum, which is this sort of orange type column here, you see that many countries had a historic maximum share that is significantly higher than what they had in the last 2 years, with 2012 being red and 2011 being blue. In other words, there has been a decline in the relative share of nuclear power over the past few years, as we have seen on the global level. Now, only one country peaked its relative share in 2012, and that was the Czech Republic, which might not be so significant for the overall picture. France peaked in 2005, and the US peaked in 1995, so a long time ago. China, interestingly enough, reached its historic maximum share in 2003, 10 years ago, with 2.2%. The 2012 figure is 2%. So basically the same thing, but slightly more already 10 years ago. So there's no relative increase in the share of nuclear power. The reason is very simple. China builds more other capacity than nuclear capacity, and builds it much faster. Talking about building, that is obviously another important parameter to assess. There are currently something like 69 reactors. So this is January 2014, 69 reactors under construction. But as we see here, there is a lighter column on top of the darker column. And the lighter column shows units that have been in the statistics as under construction, that have never been connected to the grid. In other words, we have seen throughout history, nuclear history, that many projects have actually not been completed. And to give you an order of magnitude, globally, approximately 250 units have been formally ordered. So the orders have been put out and have not been connected to the grid. Over 250 units. The stage of planning and construction was different, going from pre-construction planning to 100% built units. But there is a number of units that have actually been built completely, but have not been connected to the grid, either for technical reasons, for safety reasons, or for political reasons. Obviously, the The nuclear industry likes to point to this development over the last 10 years, which illustrates significant increase in construction sites. This is not, this is one of the reasons why it's so important to look at the movie, to look at the long-term developments. If you only look over the past 10 years, you don't understand what's actually happening. In fact, in 2005, the number of units under construction was so small that you had to go back to the 1950s, to the early 1950s, to find a similarly low number of units. And that number of units, of course, was way too low to even guarantee the turnover, a minimum turnover to stabilize the number of reactors in operation. So it was a very critical situation. And again, a significant number of units are not necessarily completed. Which countries are building? Well, there's actually only one that is a real big builder. That's China. 29 units under construction out of 69. So it's a very significant share. In fact, the top 4 countries, China, Russia, India, and South Korea, combined are over 70% of the units under construction in the world. So again, we find a very high concentration of countries that together have a very large share of a development. It's not significant for nuclear programs all over the planet. The second message from these figures is that if you look at construction start, this column, you find some amazing construction start dates, right? 1983, the record is 1972. Can you believe that? Like a nuclear reactor construction start 1972, and it's still under construction. I always try to find somebody who wants to do a doctoral thesis on this project. Because I think it would be fascinating, to try to understand, like, for example, financial flows, into this project and what it would have cost in total if ever it starts up, which we don't know. It's being pushed back again several years from the timeline. They wanted to start it up 40 years, after, like in 2012. Well, it didn't work, so they pushed it back again. But if ever it starts up, it would be fascinating, to assess the costs of this project. Maybe even write a novel about it. It's the project's name is What's Bar 2. If you're into it, let me know. I would be happy to follow the project. But there are also other countries, like Slovakia 1985, and Taiwan 1999. You have Ukraine 86, 87, Argentina 81. So there's many other projects that have been in this listing for a long time. And then the fact that they're in there for a long time is no guarantee that they will actually generate electricity. Like the last example we had was in Bulgaria, where 2 reactors were in this statistic for 25 years. 25 years. And then the projects were abandoned because there was no money. Right? So again, the fact that there's numbers here in the statistics, that gives no guarantee that they will actually start up. Now, watching these dates, we had wondered what is the development of construction times, throughout nuclear history. So what we did is, this is actually my favorite graph. We took 1 ball per year, and 1 ball is relative to the number of reactors that have been started up in that year. Okay, so it's 1 ball per year. The size of the ball is the numbers of reactors that started up at that given year. And on the vertical scale, we have the number of years that the unit was under construction prior to generating electricity. Okay? So what is the lesson? There is a very clear trend from the beginning of the nuclear age to the end of the 1980s. Remember, we had that before, didn't we? End of 1980s, crucial, absolutely crucial point in time. And what we see here is that the trend shows the balls are getting bigger and construction times are getting longer. Right? After the end of the 1980s, it's anarchy. Right? No rules to the game. The balls are getting smaller. That's the only trend that is very clear. But they jump around. Sometimes they're very high and sometimes they're very low. So we had, like, for example, 14 years average construction time in, let me see, 14 years was in 2011. And that's the average of 7 units. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? 7 units and average construction time is 14 years. I mean, when they start building these things, their sort of planned time frame is like 4 years. So these were 7 reactors that started up, and the average was 14 years. Like, one unit that really pushed the average up was the reactor in Iran that had been under construction since 1975. It made it. On the other hand, we had like 3 reactors in 2012 that started up down here on a very small average time for 4.6 years, 2 in South Korea, 1 in China. And in fact, if one looks at the sort of lower end, they're only South Korean, Japanese, before 311, of course, Japanese, South Korean, and Chinese. No other. There's nobody else that did that. So it's an interesting question. How come? How is it possible? And obviously this raises issues, for example, not only of the genius of the engineers and technicians in these countries, it also raises questions of quality control. If it's so much faster than in other countries, and we know from countries like France or Finland, where the reactors are currently under construction, that a key problem is quality control. That causes delays and makes projects expensive. So if there's no delays and projects are cheaper in South Korea and China, that raises questions also on quality control. But I don't know much about it, and I'm here to learn. So if people have information on quality control on Chinese reactors, I would be very interested in getting those. Now, I'd like to compare some of the developments in the nuclear arena with what is going on in renewable energies. One of the most fascinating developments on renewables is the technology learning curve. It's a very simple idea. Is you look at specific investment and building costs per kilowatt installed, or per megawatt, whatever capacity unit installed, and you look how the cost develops over time. Now, a typical technology learning curve shows that it becomes cheaper and cheaper, obviously, because you learn, right? And you make these systems cheaper and cheaper. The most radical drop in facility costs is photovoltaics, where, especially in Germany, it turned out to be cheaper now than in any other country, because the density is very high compared to any other country. So the soft costs, what is called soft cost everything else but the panels. The panels cost the same thing throughout the world. It's a world market. So it's every other cost. It's labor, it's publicity, it's transport, it's profit margin, etc., etc. All these costs are much lower in Germany than anywhere else. So the drop was spectacular over the last 10 years. So in 6 years it dropped by 2/3. And if you prolong, this goes up to middle of 2012, if you prolong that to the middle of last year, which is the last assessment I've seen, it's down below the horizontal line. It's roughly at 1,400 euros per installed kilowatt, which in other terms is something like 72% in drop over a 7-year period. That's a absolutely spectacular drop in facility costs. Now, the other area which is interesting, it's not only specific costs, but it's also how fast can you actually build. As we've seen, one of the problems with nuclear is that they have very long lead times. And the times we have looked at are only construction times. Construction is only one part of the lead time. You have licensing procedure, you have public involvement, you have all kinds of decision-making processes involved, so it's very long. PV is very fast. The record in Germany for grid-connected PV is 3,000 megawatts in 1 month. 3,000 megawatts in 1 month. So you compare that with the numbers of years that we've seen for nuclear project construction. So what looks the learning curve for nuclear technology like? I decided to show you the French case because France is nuclear dreamland, right? So basically all the conditions to develop nuclear power plants are much better than in any other country. France has provided consistent support, public support for nuclear programs over the past 50 years. There's a very high level of standardization. There were very little social conflicts involved, very little impact of legal cases. So it's like an ideal development context. And still the result is that we have an increase per project. This is reactor by reactor. Year by year, the reactors that started up and a cost estimate for those units. So the last unit that was connected to the grid is the most expensive. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? You should think that the learning factor brought the cost down, but the specific costs have been increasing without any major interruption. The guy who did the analysis called this forgetting by doing. I think that's a kind of a nice way to put it. Now, these are the units that have been started up. So that's the reactor park as it's currently operating. If we look at the unit that is currently under construction, there's only one. It's called the EPR. Now, EPR stands for European Pressurized Water Reactor. We call it the European Problem Reactor. And one of the reasons we call it the problem reactor is that the cost estimates have increased in a very spectacular manner. If we look at the early estimates around 2003 by the French government, what we decided was to look only at official cost estimates. So it's only the government, it's only the builder, Arriva, or the utility, EDF, or the public court of accounts. So these are only institutional or nuclear industry sources. And you can see that over the years, it has increased by approximately a factor of 4. Like even if you deflate, this is all, if it's deflated to 2012 euros, it's over a factor of 4 increase. That's a very large increase for a project of that size. So again, we have, if we had to put that on the scale here, it would not fit, right? It would be on the ceiling somewhere. Now, one of the, I would say, myths around nuclear power is to say, well, the investment costs are very high for nuclear power plants, but once they're built, they're very cheap. So operational costs are a very small fraction of the electricity generating costs. Now this is a fascinating graph from the an assessment by the French National Energy Regulator, and it has assessed that the operational costs have increased by an average of 4.5% per year over the 5-year period 2007 to 2012. So also the operational costs are increasing phenomenally over time. This does not include any additional costs due to 311. So this is pre-311 costs. The consequence of that increase was that the regulator has calculated that the tariffs are actually not covering the costs. So the largest nuclear utility in the world that has developed nuclear power under the most ideal conditions puts out electricity tariffs that are not covering the costs. That's a pretty amazing message, isn't it? And the loss for a single year in 2012 was calculated to be 1.5 billion euros loss for 1 year. So the obvious recommendation from the regulator was to say, well, you have to increase the rates significantly in order to cover the costs. Otherwise, you're going to run into deficit after deficit. Now, increasing electricity tariffs is about as popular as increasing the price of la baguette, of the French bread, Very unpopular. And it's not at a time where the French government is the most popular, right? So the government did not decide to follow the recommendations of the regulator and stayed very much underneath, but still decided to increase tariffs by 5% in 2013 and another 5% in 2014. Those are significant price increases, even though quite below what was asked for. When we look at the expected price increases over a period of time between 2013 and 2017, the cumulated difference is expected to be something like 30%. So a vast increase in tariffs. You know that we have in Europe the possibility to choose the electricity supplier. So the most expensive supplier in France was the 100% renewable energy supply. Interesting is that this company never increased the tariff. So it was very high to begin with, but it was perfectly stable. No price increase whatsoever. If the price increases of the nuclear generator is happening as forecasted, the curves will cross. In other words, the renewable energy supplier will be cheaper than the largest nuclear operator in the world. And I think that's pretty amazing as a as a result of such a long policy in favor of nuclear power. Just very briefly, this is a graph which has been released, or shall I say leaked, to the media a week ago, which shows the investment level per year for nuclear power plants in France. So you see the what they call the initial investment for the reactors that are currently operating in gray. And then you see a huge investment gap, like the money that was invested over the past decade was very little compared to the initial investment period. And this is an estimate of what is coming in terms of additional maintenance and operational costs and upgrading to bring reactors back to standard. So huge amount of money spread out over a significant number of years. And we have an additional peak here that is post-Fukushima measures that are expected. And this is under the scenario that the current reactor generating facilities, the reactors, would be replaced by EPR type units. That's a pretty steep increase over what was expected. And the peak is 10 billion per year. 10 billion per year. So we're talking a total, we don't have the figures yet, so we don't know, right? We only have this. So we will have to wait a little while until we get the figures for this. But one can roughly estimate this is somewhere between 240 and 260 billion euros. So those are gigantic figures, gigantic figures. Now, if we look at nuclear investment and compare it with new renewables investment, the term new renewables shall designate renewables outside large hydro dams. They are not considered renewable energy anymore. So this is only small hydro, solar, biomass, wind, etc. So if we look at global investment of renewables, according to a database which is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they do that every year. That's this blue curve. And there is no database for nuclear investment, at least no public one. So we don't know. And so we decided that we do sort of a back of an envelope calculation in order to get sort of a very rough idea. And what we did is we looked at construction starts year by year since 2004, and we allocated the total sum of a project that goes underway for that given year, which obviously is not very realistic because, you know, construction costs are spread out over many years. So in reality, this red curve is much smaller than what we see here. The increase and the decrease here is you know, mainly China, which is the only country that has actually started up a significant amount of nuclear projects over that period. And that is the freeze of the Chinese program for 1 year after after 2011 happened. Whatever the exact figure would be, it's very clear that the difference between the two is an order of magnitude. An order of magnitude. What are the countries investing? China has been leading for the past 2 years. Those are the first estimates. We don't have them for all of the countries yet. But China would be still leading over the US investment. I don't expect any other country to come in between the two. So that should be the ranking anyway. China first, US second. what we can see already is that Japan is catching up very quickly. So Japan has been going from 9 billion investment to over 35 billion in only 2 years. That's a very steep increase. Now, what is the outcome of that kind of investment? This is the capacity installed in wind, solar, and nuclear. So we see this since 2000, okay? So we see this very steep increase in wind power. These are huge numbers now. I mean, 260 gigawatts is 260,000 megawatts. If you think that a nuclear reactor is about 1,000 megawatts, that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. But also solar is catching up very quickly. It's now about 100 gigawatts already installed. And nuclear power, has almost not moved in terms of installed capacity since 2000. Now, the change of electricity generation over that time by those three technologies, you see the huge increase in wind and solar, and in 2012, nuclear reactors actually generated less power than they did in the year 2000. So it's an opposite trend for nuclear power. This is probably quite different from what you had in mind, isn't it? I mean, people always think that nuclear power is kind of going up and up and up. Not really, if you look at the figures. So the outcome is that we had, in 2012, for the first time, 3 of the 4 largest economies in the world that generated more power from renewables than from nuclear power. In fact, China and India generated more power from wind alone than from nuclear power. And according to figures I've seen for 2013, this is true for China again. So although there were 3 nuclear power plants that started up in 2013 in China, wind generated even faster, it increased even faster, and generated even more power. So we have another year where there's still more power being generated by wind alone. Another country that joins the club in 2013 is Spain, which generated more power from wind than from nuclear power. In fact, wind was the #1 generating technology in Spain, so larger than anything else, which is a quite amazing development. One brief look at the United States, what happened between 2001 and 2011. This is electricity generation, and it's the difference between what they did generate in 2001 and what they generate in 2011. And you see like a huge increase in gas. This is due to what people call the shale gas revolution, massive production of shale gas. The whole development of shale gas happened over that period. But we have large increases in wind and hydro, tiny increase in nuclear. This is not because of new reactors at all. No new reactors started up. But it's because of what I said earlier, because of operating and because of better operational conditions. And we have oil and coal that is on the downward trend. We look at the similar graph for the European Union. This is not production, it's installed capacity, so attention. The difference in installed capacity between those 2 years is that the main message is that the 2 renewable sources, wind and solar alone, increased more than natural gas. So that it's already taken over in terms of installed capacity. And nuclear joins the club of the declining technologies like oil and coal. Now I have a few countries, which I just want to briefly mention. We can come back to that if you have interest in one or the other country. Belgium is interesting because they basically had a nuclear phase-out legislation in place when Fukushima happened. And so they basically had only to reactivate that, confirm that pre-existing legislation. I was an advisor to the energy minister when that legislation was developed, so I have a pretty first-hand experience on that. Bulgaria is the project that was withdrawn that I've mentioned earlier. Maybe a quick look at Chinese numbers on nuclear construction and nuclear projects. As you see, there was a freeze in 2011 with no new construction initiation. 3 in each year, 2012 and 2013. Reactor startups, 2 in 2011 and 1 in 2012 and 2013. If you go back through to planning of Chinese policy of 10 years ago, this is far below what was planned, far below. But I'm still not very clear of where the Chinese nuclear program is going. And I think maybe the government and the industry is not clear neither about where it's going. So, but at least it's you know, there are many questions that are around the Chinese nuclear program. On the other hand, what we clearly see is that the renewable energy program has been boosted significantly over pre-existing planning. 2011 and 2012, if you combine the years, it's 33,000 megawatts of wind. It's like 13 times more than nuclear in wind alone, which is quite staggering. You know, the total capacity is now more than the French nuclear capacity. And the target, as what we've seen, is 100 gigawatts by 2015. Even solar has been enlarged faster than nuclear. And the target has been multiplied by a factor of 4 to 21 gigawatts by 2015. And of course, the output, the result of investment, major investment, is this huge increase in installed capacity of wind. The red is nuclear and the green is solar. And here we see the wind curve that has bypassed now the nuclear production in 2012 for the first time. A couple of comments on France. I think that internationally the development in France is underestimated. We have, for the first time in decades, a government that has actually said we should reduce the relative significance of nuclear power compared to what we have now. The target is to bring it down to 50% from about 3/4 by 2025, and to shut down the first 2 nuclear reactors, the 2 oldest reactors in the country, by the end of 2016. This target of 50% 2025 means that over 20 nuclear reactors would have to be shut down if the electricity consumption level is about the same. If the consumption level goes down, it would be, of course, even more. In other words, in terms of nuclear phase-out or nuclear reduction, it's a much more ambitious program than the German program. Much more ambitious. And I don't think that people really realize that. It's a very different message that is coming out of France compared to what came out of France for the past 5 decades. There has been, after 3/11, as in many other countries, a huge surge of people that are in favor of a nuclear phase-out. In parallel to these developments, the nuclear companies have been in big trouble for some years. If you look at the development of stock value, it's been plunging significantly since it peaked around 2007, 2008. And there's a very high debt load. Areva, which is the largest nuclear builder in the world, Areva is also involved in the Taishan project, building EPRs in China. Areva has lost a significant amount of money for the third year in a row. So this company is not doing very well. And it's also an indicator for the health of the industry. Here we have the illustration of the stock price development of EDF, nuclear utility, in comparison to the CAC 40, which is the national indicator. It's like the largest company in the 40 largest company in France. That's how they did, and this is how EDF did. So you can see that there's some increase that happened over the past year, but it's very small compared to where they come from. It's again, when you only look since 2013 when it reached the bottom, it's a nice way to present it, right? If you just take this part of this history. EDF likes that, to show this part. It had quite significant influence. Yes, this is the drop here is for. So it had. If you look at the relative share, price at that moment, and you see the drop, it's very significant. And this is the same for Areva versus the CAC 40, and we see a similar gigantic drop. It's actually up to, like if you look at the peak and you look at the bottom, like from the highest to the lowest, it's 88%. 88%, you can compare that with TEPCO in Japan, which is the owner of the disaster plant. They lost something like 94%. One wonders what's the Areva disaster. We're not really clear about that. So they're in big trouble because business is not going well. Germany I will skip because we hear about this from our German colleague. In the United Kingdom, basically it's a very interesting case because we have an environment where the government has been extremely favorable to nuclear power for the last 2 or 3 terms. Whether Tories, like the right-wingers, or the Labour left-wingers, both have been extremely favorable to nuclear new build. But if one looks in the history of the projects of new build, one realizes that more and more utilities have actually abandoned the idea of building new nuclear power plants in the UK. There was a preliminary agreement signed between the government, UK government, and EDF, which is a very unusual agreement. It basically says that the UK government guarantees a price for nuclear electricity coming from new nuclear power plants that is twice as high as the current price that is in the grid. So we've never seen any kind of agreement like that. And the length of the agreement would be like a guaranteed price for 35 years. Which is, one wonders what the, UK citizens will say in 10 years when the prices are completely different, what they will say to the government that signed something like that. But it's not a done deal yet because the European Commission will look at the question whether this kind of government support is actually legal under European competition rules. Maybe let me jump to the conclusions, because I've been running out of time, as I see. Basically, nuclear power plays a decreasing role, and that decreasing role has been always very small, much smaller than what people realize. So it's about 10% of the electricity, 4.5% of commercial primary energy. And I insist on the term commercial because a lot of energy is non-commercial in the world. Biomass use in the country, in China, or in India, or in Africa, is in no statistics, for example, because it's not being traded. So unless energy is traded, it's not in any statistics. So, and the 4.5% is like the lowest since the middle of the 1980s, according to BP. In the end, the key figure is actually final energy. What does mean final energy? When you use primary energy, let's say you burn coal in a power plant, then you lose like 2/3 of the energy in the form of heat, and you transform only the rest into electricity, then you lose another 10 to 15% of the grid. So what you get out of it in the end is like only a quarter of the primary energy. So what we're actually interested in is to see what is the share in the final energy, which actually arrives at the consumer. And that we don't know have the figures because it's obviously something you can only estimate. But it's definitely less than 2%. So can you get rid of less than 2% in the world? Is that possible? I mean, it seems obvious, isn't it? So it's not something that plays a huge role. And it's quite clear now that further decline is to be expected. Fukushima overall increases the cost, doesn't make it more competitive because of safety, but also because of insurance costs that increase, financing issues, etc. Public opinion in many countries is highly dubitative. Competence issues, skills issue is actually a big issue. In many countries, the problem is a skills gap because of aging. In France, for example, between 2012, the 5 years, 2012 to 2017, the EDF has to replace half of its workers, nuclear workers, half of its employees. That's a huge challenge. How do you do that? How do you train young people in such a short period of time? China has a similar problem, not because of aging, but because of build-up. Right? The build-up is very fast. And it's a very big problem to train technicians and engineers so fast and make them perform under very challenging conditions. Nuclear companies are in trouble. We've seen that. And in many leading economies, you cannot really find any prospects for a nuclear future. That paves the way for much more and higher percentages of renewables. But, and I didn't get into this because this is not the subject of the presentation, but there are many issues that remain to be solved for a renewable energy-based future. And these include that we really have to shift the entire system from a vertical integration to horizontal integration. It means we have to get away from centralized generation of power, but not only power, also heat or gas or other fuels to decentralized level. And we need the system for that. And I'm sure, as we will hear from Germany, it's one of the biggest challenges in Germany is that, yes, there are now 1.3 million producers of electricity, essentially with PV and wind. but the grid is lacking. That is actually up to the challenge of horizontal interconnection. The future will look like much more like the internet. Nobody suggests today to build a super big computer. Can you imagine somebody would say, well, I want to build a very, very large computer? People would say, did you miss the last 20 years or something? I mean, it's millions of computers that provide computing power. And on the energy level, it's about the same thing. We're talking not anymore about producers and consumers. We talk about prosumers. Because it becomes the same thing, right? I mean, producers are actually consuming and vice versa. They have to be interconnected in a quite different way. And this is the case in the vertical integration. So this is a big, big challenge. And finally, I think that the development of policy instruments, business models, and innovative regulation is needed in order to continue to support this kind of development. So there's a lot on the plate yet. But I think we can be quite hopeful to what is going on in the rest of the world. Thank you very much for your attention.